Welcome to the Delta. I'm Jessica Bagian, president of Watershed Advisors. And this month for Women's History Month, we're highlighting women who are shaping education leadership today. I'm joined by a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Julia Rafal-Baer, CEO of ILO Group and CEO of Women Leading Ed, the nation's largest network of women education leaders, supporting over 500 leaders across all 50 states through sponsorship, professional development, and community. Before this, Julia served as an assistant commissioner at the New York State Department of Education and as the chief operating officer of Chiefs for Change, where we first met many, many years ago. Julia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. This is so much fun.
So we're going to start with the state of women in education leadership.
Okay.
You are one of, if not the leading advocate for having more women in positions of power in education. And the point you often make is that even though women dominate the teacher workforce, they are absolutely underrepresented in the central office. And your team, in a number of different ways, has built efforts to try to combat this and take this on, including a data set that's tracking superintendent leadership over time. So I'm curious from that data to start, where have we made progress in starting Women Leading Ed? And where are we really still seeing challenges?
So let's go back to the start, which you were a part of, and thinking back to that conference room and think about 2018. I think when we objectively look at the data, and I really appreciate just how much work our team has put into building this data set that we now have. We have 10 years worth of data. And we can now see very clearly that in 2018, only 27% of the top 500 superintendents were women, and we are this year at 33.4%. I am not going out on mountains screaming we've done it, right? But that is clearly measurable progress in that way. Back when we started in 2018, every single woman in that room said they had no network like what we were trying to create. Everyone said they had no support systems, that there was nobody out there convening them the way that we were attempting to do so. To now be in a place where it's 2026, we are an independent nonprofit organization, the largest national network, and we've now passed the 600 mark. So we have women in every state. This year's summit is going to be 250 women. I mean, it's wild when I think about just the incredible growth and progress that has occurred. On just a very real note, it's no longer a question about what's happening for women. Back in 2018 and throughout COVID, there were all these questions about what is happening with the state of the superintendency, and we've now answered that. And so now we have a very clear set of data that allows us to start asking a lot more questions about the experience of women.
Truly, and gave us a baseline to work from and to know that you've made the gains you've made and also still how far we have to go. Yeah. I think one of the interesting things you study is how the superintendent searches shape who gets the role and how the biases, of search firms and boards show up in those searches. So let's start with the search firms. How search firms influence who ultimately gets considered for these top roles. What have you learned?
I mean, first of all, it's hard to believe that it's going on nearly a decade that I've been doing this work. And we've seen so much in terms of what's happening across the country with search firms. And I wish I could say that there was some bright spots where it's I can give you a whole bunch of searches that have not gone in this pattern I'm about to describe. But so often, the majority of the way the processes work, there are groups of retired former superintendents who are tapped to help go to their networks and tap people for searches. And that then perpetuates who gets into these pools, which are more often than not former white male superintendents who are tapping white males from their network. And so right off the bat, you have this challenge of who is even helping to conduct these searches. Then there's a whole bunch of other challenges in terms of not having enough of a check and balance on the kinds of questions that get asked. There are so many ways that bias shows up in these processes, questions that are never asked of men, that are asked of women, different bars that are held, and of course then just bias about who should even be a superintendent. So much of what happens with a lot of these search firms is they're calling candidates that are woefully unprepared for these roles and telling them, no, you're exactly the right candidate. I mean, I can't even tell you how many people come through our leadership training academy, and the first thing they tell me is that, search firm X has just told them that they are the candidate for the search. And I'm like, you're not the candidate for the search. You are helping to round out a pool. And I think getting to this point where you recognize that a search firm is not your agent, and not only are they not your agent, they need you to stay in till the end. That's the entire goal in what's happening, not because they think that you're necessarily the best candidate for that search. Those issues on the front end are a problem. But there's also this challenge that because so many of these retired superintendents are tapping a pool, what's happening is many of these search firms are now getting contracts with the locations they're working in to do work on the other side. Oh, when your candidate gets it, we'll do their 100-day plan. We'll do their strategic plan. We'll do all of their coaching. In many cases, boards are just automatically signing these contracts. So it's then locking the superintendents into this. And it creates this very challenging set of incentives where you have former superintendents trying to tap leaders for those roles so that in turn, then they are doing this package of services on the other side. And you need a search firm to be very, very neutral in this. You need search firms to not play both sides. You want a search firm whose entire job is seeking out the absolute most qualified, most talented, and most aligned for what that community is looking for. I think it's a huge problem. And I think it's one where, at the very simplest, every state should just say, search firms working in our state, you cannot do anything but run the search. That's your job. That in itself would help change things in a big way.
Yeah, I did not understand the sort of contract on the other side. And also, it doesn't surprise me at all as you say it. It's just not a thing I knew about. Fascinating.
Yeah.
And gross. Let's talk about women within the context of the sort of typical process you just named. So what is your research showing about how women are or aren't positioned in these processes? And, even through the steps you just described, this could either be ways you see it trip women up or the sort of solution side of it, which is things that you wish states were doing more of to ensure a fair process for all involved.
Yeah. So one of my favorite things about our data set is that with as much data as we have, we now can look at what the job titles were before people became superintendents and then how they move around within the data set. And we have learned so much. We can now see very clearly that men are far more likely to get the job as an external candidate, meaning that they have no connection to the district that they're working in. So they're being hired based on their propensity and the belief that they are going to be that, aggressive, decisive, tough, that kind of leadership quality that we so often in a biased way emphasize. Women are far more likely to get the top job when they've been the internal candidate. So meaning they're the deputy, and in most cases, that's the job title. And then when they serve as the interim first. In fact, about half the time that a woman serves as the interim first, she gets the top job, which makes sense, right? Because bias, women have to show they can do the job, they can knock it out of the park, and then they're trusted to stay in that role. Years ago, one of the state superintendents, when he was leaving his role, said to me, I want to really work on a succession for one of my internal candidates, and asked me at the time about what I thought. And I thought about the interim because we'd seen that happen with Susana Cordova. And I thought, okay, maybe that is a piece of it. But now it's very clear that actually really is the way to start to think about this. And that means giving women many more up-at-bats in this process. But I also think we have to do a lot more, particularly at the state level, to really counteract bias. And I want to just tell you a quick story about the way that I've seen this play out. There is a major state in our country, one that purports that it wants to go back to being real strong on NAEP. And yet over the last 10 years, I've watched them do two search processes where each time they've chosen the man over the much more qualified women in their pool. So each time they say, we really need to get this technical policy implemented in a stronger way. We need stronger accountability, stronger data, stronger systems. The first time, they chose a leader who during his interview literally said he didn't understand how an SEA worked. And during the deliberation, they start talking about how that showed so much humility. Wasn't it so incredible that he didn't know how a state worked? And then they chose him over two incredibly, very qualified state leaders. Then the second time they go for their search, Similar pattern is emerging in this search. They're deliberating and they start talking about how the man in the search, how he didn't use his notes and he spoke extemporaneously. And like, wasn't that just incredible? So this idea that his charisma was what was going to make him the right leader over the woman who objectively knew their system inside and out, understood the policy changes, understood the funding formula changes. But none of that in those moments is how these processes actually work in the realm of the politics that impacts it. And of course, then, and you're very familiar with this story, there was Maria Izquierdo in Sarasota, Florida. Marie had been the chief academic officer, seen as the chief architect of the turnaround that had occurred in Miami schools. So she goes for Sarasota, Florida. Every part of the search, she's the number one candidate. Everyone is picking her. Very public process. It finally gets to the board round and she calls me after and she tells me that the board asked her lots of questions, but nothing about her academic vision. She said they did ask me these questions about my husband and about my daughter, whether they were going to come with me. It was very strange. And I was like, this is not good. So the next day they start the deliberation and you can always tell in a search, they anchor the first few board members that talk. So the first one starts and she says, gosh, Marie was my favorite until she told us that she wasn't going to move with her husband and daughter. And that was a non-starter for me. How could we ever choose a candidate when we couldn't trust them that they were here? And then the next female board member just starts piling on too. And starts, you're absolutely right. She was delightful. First of all, delightful. Lots of things we're going to say about Maria Izquierdo, like bold, brilliant, but as soon as you use a gendered word, delightful, and then starts, carrying on about how they wouldn't be able to trust her. Let's be clear. It was Sarasota to Miami. It's the middle of the school year. Her daughter's a junior and a track athlete. This was like, none of these things should matter, but like, obviously she was not going to move. At that point, I had placed 24 leaders. None of the men had ever moved with their families. Just like that wasn't even a thing. Some of them never moved their families, some moved later. So I share these examples because the bias that we see, it's not behind closed doors. It's literally just in front of us. And to me, these are just big pieces that we got to get a handle on and how these processes work.
Yeah, she is delightful, but she is also so many more things beyond that. And I do remember that search and just particularly if you've ever looked at the results of Miami, it's just sort of wild that you would have the potential to get someone of her caliber and walk away from it. It does make me wonder about, Julia, have you all done any studying of sort of like on the other side of it, which leaders are most effective and what, if any, sort of trends or takeaways we have from that to inform the search on the front end? Just to answer more directly the question, like, if you want somebody to lead a really big district well, here's the characteristics that most sit with individuals in that space. Or, a state job is not a district job. It's a policy job, not a buses and buildings job. Like what the most successful state chiefs have had in common. Does that exist, or have y'all taken that on?
We have a proposal to do a very massive research study in partnership with Dr. Constance Lindsay that would explore this. And this is actually the thing that we think is missing from all of the work, because the challenge is, other than NAEP, we don't have a lot of data that allows us to try to create those kinds of comparisons. But there's just been some really interesting studies, particularly done in both the medical sector as well as in political science, that have looked at the effectiveness of women doctors, surgeons in particular, and impact on patients and mortality rates and recovery times. In the political science, about women who've been able to pass more bills and fundraise more. So, we have a lot of different ideas about what we think that can look like, and are seeking philanthropy to be able to do that at a pretty significant level. I think, part of the challenge has been that we have pipelines that prioritize particular skill sets that don't actually always match the things we're looking for in this moment. So our pipelines prioritize a skill set around finance, operations, and certainly much more of that system oversight. Whereas we really tend to not prioritize the academic pathway. And so what we have found as we've been looking at the data is that you will see the skewed pipeline that starts to emerge as soon as teachers start moving up their career. They tend to go more into elementary school principal if they're women. Men tend to go to high school principal. High school principal, maximum exposure. You've got boards, you've got the football games, you've got bigger construction projects, typically much bigger budgets. And so when roles open up in central office, it's those men who get tapped. So as we looked at our data set, there are no women that had moved from high school principal to the top 500. There were 10 men that moved from high school principal to the top 500. And so throughout that, you start to then see, even if they don't go straight to the superintendent, they're going much more into the operational side, chief of schools, chief operating officer. Women go from that elementary school principal, and typically if they're tapped to go into central, it's then into the academic or teaching and learning pathways. And as we then look at the state side, both political parties have been choosing candidates from the superintendency and from within their states much more often than in previous time periods. But that means that who they're typically tapping are not people who've come up from that academic pathway at a time where we're saying that we're prioritizing this recovery effort. And that's incredibly unfortunate. And I think it's going to really take governors and their policy advisors and those who are helping to advise them to really ask that question. Who do you need on your cabinet who's waking up every day thinking about the academic trajectory of kids? And how do you then help to provide them with the best possible supports around them to be able to do the rest of the job as effectively as possible, but that their North Star is 100% on that academic recovery for your state? And unfortunately, we just don't have a whole lot of governors and their teams who prioritize in that way.
I want to talk about once individuals get the role, these are hard jobs. And they are political jobs
Yeah.
and they are academic jobs. And one of the things that I think most hurts teams and kids ultimately is the churn in these jobs. Like when it doesn't work, that like being back in the state of search, which has happened even in my hometown, is really problematic. You know, you pile on top of that declining enrollment, increased politicization, funding uncertainty, AI, which you do a lot of work on. It's just even more demanding than perhaps it's ever been. And I'm curious, once individuals get into the role, what are you seeing it takes for them to stay and succeed? And what lessons are you taking from that?
Two big areas for me. One is obviously networks. I think women leading ed matters a lot. And I get so many texts and or so much feedback from the women about the power of the relationships they have in the network and how much that helps to sustain them in these roles. And that it has become so much of just like real time 24/7 supports. You're going through something. It doesn't matter if Emily and I and the team don't have what you need. There's someone who does, and we get it immediately. That real time support and knowing you have a network that has your back and that like you can trust is everything in this work. And it's everything in life. I mean, we all know like how lonely work can feel when you don't have those kinds of webs of people who aren't there for you in a transactional way. They're there like they actually deeply want you to succeed. And that is really powerful. The second, I think we have to like get rid of mentorship. Like I think we should like literally stop every mentor program, every like mentor initiative, and really move into sponsorship and get really real about why these things are very different. A mentor's person is going to get a call and they're going to tell you about how they did things and, their war stories, and those things matter and those matter for relationships, but that's not what's going to help you in the moments to be able to get to that next level. Sponsors are the people who help to really shape what you're doing. They're the people that give the stretch assignments, or the people who push you harder than you think you can push yourself. The challenge I often see is particularly when it comes to feedback. What I hear often from men and women who are trying to sponsor or support other women is how challenging it can be, the experience of giving another person feedback, in particular their experience with women. That often there's a feeling that women are not taking that feedback in the more strategic and operational way. They're feeling it in a more personal way. Well, on one hand, the research is clear that women, and particularly women of color, are more often given feedback that's on a personal level. But I think there's also just become a bit of a challenge in the way that we as a culture have developed our feelings about feedback, that somehow that is seen as like not being perfect enough, not being strong enough in what you're doing, rather than seeing it that someone's actually investing their time to tell you what the bar is, and like now go meet it. Like that should be the exciting part of it. And to me, that's what really good sponsors do. One woman who does a lot of sponsoring said to me, like, I just want to sponsor winners. Like, I want to know that I am making a bet on a winner, and then I want to see her just show up, and I want to see her show up harder and harder, and I'll tell her when she's not at the bar. And she told me, she said, I don't want to sponsor women who don't get that. If they're not ready to be at that bar, then I don't want to sponsor them. And I think that's the part we got to get to, is like that recognition that sponsors are putting themselves out there too.
Yeah, I love that. And one thing we say at Watershed, especially in our early days, is like feedback is love. Like your ideas get better, your skills get better. And, when we're offering feedback, it is from a place of just like deep belief in your capacity to
Yes,
continue to level up on behalf of kids. I love that.
absolutely.
Since we are doing this series for Women's History Month,
Yeah.
you spent your career working across state systems, national organizations, now through both ILO and Women Leading Ed, focusing on strengthening leadership and expanding pathways for women. I have two questions for you on this. First, what advice would you give to women who want to step into education leadership?
Number one, you're ready. Like 100% you're ready. Like what our research shows over and over again is that women are taking longer at every career rung than their male counterparts. We're going to be putting out a study in a couple of months about this. We analyzed hundreds of searches and worked with a search agency to be able to use their search pool with their resumes. And it like is so wild to me how women across every part of their career are staying so much longer than their male counterparts. And then when you talk to them, they're like, well, I had a project I had to finish, or I felt like I had some responsibility still. And like all those things can be true, but it is also true that is not what men are doing. So number one, for every woman, it's like you are 100% ready. Number two, though, these jobs are really, really complex. And I've been thinking a lot about the reality of what's happening with elder care responsibility in our country. It is disproportionately falling on women. And it's not like we've gotten to where we need to on child care benefits, but we've certainly made some progress in that realm. We're not there right now with elder care. I don't know a single superintendent at the state or district level that we've worked with, at least, that has negotiated anything around elder care specifically into their agreements. And I think we have to start to get real about how that is having an impact. I've been thinking a lot about the role of duos, when leaders are able to rise and have somebody else who they are rising with, someone who they've worked with previously that they know they can really count on, and how different those kinds of results are. Think of like Janice Jackson, LaTanya McDade, right? Like the outsized impact of having LaTanya being there to rise with Janice, always having her back, their commitments that they would disagree in private, come out united in public. Like, I think that role of duos is really, really important. And I think we haven't done enough to spotlight when two women work together and get outsized results. And I think women and men too, don't get me wrong. But I think this idea, though, that the job actually needs a depth of relationship that you can then use to just knock it out of the park, I think is actually really important.
I love that. To close out, who is one woman in education whose work you think our listeners and readers should be following right now?
Crystal Hill in Charlotte-Mecklenburg. I am just continuously blown away by her. She was the internal candidate. She was the interim, all the things. She'd been the chief of staff there. This was a district, I forget what the stat is, but it's something crazy. It's like they'd had like 12 superintendents in 6 years kind of thing. Like it's just like a very wild amount of superintendents before her. And you think about back in the Pete Gorman days, this was like Broad, prize district. Like we all talked about the incredible human capital work and all the great things happening. And it really had lost its way over time. Dr. Hill has just done this extraordinary job. She manages the politics so well. She has brought about such a massive change effort within the district and their academic vision. And she's taken such a strong and careful and ethical approach to her AI implementation. And I just look at her and I think, my gosh, if we could have a million more Crystal Hills in the world, like this is what would create such a turnaround in our state. So Crystal Hill.
I love that. And I have not had the pleasure of meeting her, so I look forward to that happening. Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. For those of you watching, you can find this conversation and others in our Women's History Month series by searching The Delta on your favorite podcast platforms. And you can also watch the full video and read the transcript on LinkedIn at The Delta. Thank you so much.